exploring the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts. That's what we do at Kung Fu Podcast, and I'm your host, T.W. Smith. Thank you so much for joining me, and I believe this is part 4 as we're going into the Bubishi, and I must tell you, when I first began, I thought there was going to be a 3-part series, but put it in perspective, there was a lot more information that I had actually counted on, and then I had to actually do a little bit more research in order to tell the story in a way that made sense to me first, and hopefully it will do the same with you. In the last episode, we had hit fixed point number 12, where we were talking about martial manuals and the bronze statue notebooks, and we had also discussed about our martial arts ancestors, that, for example, in order for them to teach and survive and practice their martial arts, as they moved from place to place, it required an understanding of trauma care and Chinese medicine that was the type of medicine that was appropriate for them at that time and accessible for them at that time. This fact alone would then put an economical value on their manuscript, because other up-and-coming martial artists were sure to want to have it. Now, in this episode, we're going to start in Chapter 2, which is titled The Contents and Structure of the Bubishi. And again, it's going to pick up with the bronze statue notebooks. And in case you didn't know, that reference is to Song Dynasty Wang Wei Yi in 1027 A.D. Now, this man was the one who was responsible for creating 2 bronze statues for acupuncture. And then along with those statues came the illustrated manual of acupoints on the bronze statue. Those books from the 11th century illustrate all the meridians and appropriate acupoints of the time. We're also going to be taking a look into Chapter 3 titled Revere Heaven and Emulate the Ancestors. Chapter 4 titled The Ryukyu House. Chapter 5 is titled The Crane Formation, and that's an interesting one all unto itself. And then we're going to introduce terms Xiaofai and Koju and begin deciphering some of the Chinese texts in the Wu Beiji. If this is your first time to Kung Fu Podcast, welcome. You are in the audience of some of the finest and sharpest martial artists in the world. Folks who really do put a lot of effort and care into their craft and practice with the understanding of always keeping their purpose, their objectives about their training in front of them. I appreciate you stopping by and giving me an opportunity to introduce myself and the program. And if you ever have any comments, go to kungfupodcast.com and just send me a note. Love to hear from you. Get yourself ready. We're getting ready to go from Chapter 2 to Chapter 5 of the General Tian Wu Beiji. The description of this chapter, titled Contents and Structure of the Bubishi, says that we're going to review the contents and structure of 4 different Bubishi editions. They're going to assess the structure of those editions against the general outline of bronze statue notebooks. The authors reach a very interesting conclusion on the Bubishi's original scope, even while addressing some of the Bubishi's more puzzling aspects. Just as a reminder that goes all the way back to part 1 of this series, it's a reminder that often we think of the Bubishi as a singular text. The researchers just mentioned that they were comparing 4 different editions and 4 different lineages of the Bubishi textual tradition. The Bubishi is a multidisciplinary, multi-author, multi-edited, multi-time period, and multi-geographical manuscript. Though much of the information is gathered from a southern China area, that's a really large area. Southern China is generally referencing an area that has 200 million people and an area of 444,000 miles. So in Chapter 2, they're going to take this manuscript and compare its contents and its structure to another type of document, the bronze statue notebooks. And after they share their conclusion with you, that's going to take us into Chapter 3, and that is titled Revere Heaven, Emulate the Ancestors. And this chapter is dedicated to explaining the role of guardian deities, as was the deity General Tian, in Kung Fu schools in general, and in particularly for this Bubishi's authors. This discussion is especially enlightening because it sheds light on an overlooked but highly important aspect of Kung Fu culture: Chinese beliefs, practices, routines, especially recognizing your ancestors. And that information is going to lead us to a diplomatic institution. The Ruqian House was the name of the Ruqian Embassy of Fuzhou City, Fujian. However, it also served as a prestigious college of Chinese studies, an institution where Chinese masters were grooming elite Ryukyuan students to become scholars and diplomats. Ben writes, quote, "This exploration begins with the discussion of the centrality of Confucian thought to Chinese martial arts philosophy, which you will find useful." End quote. There are often questions about the supposed Buddhist or Taoist origins of some specific art, and in Ben's case, that's usually Wing Chun. But Ben also makes an interesting suggestion to most folks who are serious about, quote, grasping the philosophical roots of their system, end quote. He writes that those interested in the links between the Southern martial arts and Chinese opera will want to pay close attention to the exploration of General Tian and this deity's links to both social spheres. I made a note here for you because that line of thinking, Confucian philosophical roots inside of the martial arts, is something that you're going to want to kind of put in the reservoir of Chinese martial arts knowledge, because it's going to be a big deal when we get into the rituals, martial arts, and the missionaries and the martial arts, which is slated for a future podcast. In Chapter 3, you may appreciate the carefully laid out discussion of the system of devoted piety and ancestor worship when it comes to understanding the nature of traditional and even modern Kung Fu schools. These sorts of discussions always run the risk of creating the illusion of an unchanging and static ethnographic present. Authors like Professor Bernard Farr, who has authored books like Unmasking Buddhism and Chan Insights and Oversights, an epistemological critique of the Chan tradition. And then there's also Professor Frederick Wakeman, who has pointed out that some of the region's most basic social structures, such as lineage organizations and clan temples, underwent substantial changes during the late imperial period. This was especially evident during the middle years of the 18th century, when the relationships between these larger social structures and the clan militias, and as well as other paramilitary societies, began to shift. And that brings us to fixed point number 13. The cultural deity known as General Tian is an important influence to understanding the Chinese martial arts. And that brings us into Chapter 4. In Chapter 4, you're going to learn about a real argument that this colorful establishment, located in the martial arts hotbed of Fuzhou, was quite possibly also the birthplace of the Bubishi, explicitly dating and pointing to the authorship of the Bubishi. The authors begin Chapter 4 with an admission that it is just not possible to prove or reject theories in this area, but they are going to lay out facts about times and as well a very objective argument. The historical record is not deep enough or broad enough to prove anything. The best we can do is to decide which idea seems to be the most credible, and Ben states that this is certainly a frustration that he can empathize with. Which now brings us to Chapter 5, where the authors say that in one of the Bubishi's historical philosophical tracts, there appears to be this somewhat mysterious sentence that says Lu Han is also crane. Now, in Chapter 5, Crane Formation, the authors put this sentence against the background of martial evolution in the 19th century in Fujian. This is going to point to a pivotal stage in martial arts history, as well as shed light on the nature and martial style practiced by the original Bubishi's authors. Ben writes in his review that Nissan and Louis explicitly linked the text to martial arts circles that gathered around the Ryukyu Trade Tribute Station in Fuzhou. This compound also included a Confucian school that educated many of the best and brightest minds of the island kingdom. Of course, now, Fuzhou was also a regional martial arts hotspot. Drawing on subtle clues from the text, the authors convincingly argue that this text was compiled sometime after 1860. Now, they're going to go on to argue a little bit less convincingly that it was assembled by successive generations of Kung Fu-obsessed students at the Ryukyu House before they got shipped back to their families. Serious students of Southern China's martial arts history will find Chapter 5 very interesting. Once an approximate date has been established for the text, these authors did a remarkable job in finding an approximate date that the text was established. With that, it is now possible to ask what this text tells us about the development of the martial arts in a specific city at a known point in time. Using the text of the Bubishi, the authors explore the process by which the mid-century spread of Yongcheng white crane impacted the subsequent developments of systems like Lohong boxing and Five Ancestors. He goes on to write that once dated to a specific period, the Bubishi offers a window onto the process by which the conceptual and philosophical basis of white crane spread and was layered onto other pre-existing regional martial practices. The mid-19th century was a time of great innovation in the Fujianese martial arts, as masters were challenged to create more effective fighting systems. They often did this through a process of martial fusion, facilitated by the spread of the conceptual aspects of white crane. Indeed, the Bubishi seems to record an intermediary phase in the formation of Fuzhou white crane that illustrates the process by which these arts became progressively softer as the centuries progressed. It is also important to understand that Fuzhou did not exist in isolation. Mr. Douglas Weil has explored the increasing emphasis on softness seen in Tai Chi Chuan circles during the late 19th century. Furthermore, the mid-19th century expansion of martial fusion in Fujian corresponds to the explosive growth of Choli Foot, which is also another remarkably acquisitive system. On a personal note, Choli Foot is the fighting system that the majority of my U.S. Army classmates would get submerged into first, because it is extraordinarily effective and the primary techniques can be learned rather quickly. But as we move along in this chapter, this mid-1800s martial fusion expansion also added to the rapid spread of the white crane creation story and aspects of its conceptual system into the Pearl River Delta. Both of these forces would have a profound impact on the development of Wing Chun and other regional styles. Ben writes this about the author's work. He says, "The author's argument is elegant, textually supported, and modest in nature. It reinforces a number of other discussions of what was going on in other regional martial arts centers during the late 19th century. Yet, Nissan and Louis' contribution is unique, as the Bubishi provides an actual record of how this process of fusion and transformation unfolded." The general Tien Wubeiji also includes the often referred to illustrated sections. The author, Mr. Nissan, writes that there are 46 pages, and at the center of each page there is an illustration depicted two kung fu fighters going through various fighting drills. Each illustration is accompanied by two lines of characters on both the left and the right sides of each illustration. It is expected that the left-hand line corresponds to the warrior illustrated on the left, and the right-hand line with the warrior on the right. These lines are part of the mystery surrounding the Wubeiji. For example, are these lines some kind of commentary? Or are they simply the names of the techniques that warriors are executing? In this version, they bring a very cultural perspective to these illustrations and these lines, one that many traditional Chinese martial artists are hopefully already familiar with. The authors had to be very selective about what text they inserted into this section, because after all, this was the illustration section. As we mentioned before in this series, if you were a martial artist and you had this transcript, this book has tremendous value. If someone was to steal it, it would be obvious what the nature of the book is all about, but interpreting it would require an apprentice of sorts, more detailed instruction than what is just displayed as face value on those pages. Again, this is something you will hear much about more in future podcasts regarding a Chinese cultural tradition where we have this obscurity in plain sight, but it is something that you should know has been around for centuries. I'd also like to share with you something personal, because during this particular podcast, I had my own sort of awareness jolted. You know, when I started Kung Fu in the late 1980s, I did not think of myself as a very good student. I had my ways of doing things. I had my way of thinking about things. I had plenty of success in all those things. And unfortunately, I would say at least 50 to 60% of my way of thinking wasn't going to work. Unfortunately, I had to go through the process of realizing that everything was not a nail and I was not always a hammer. I also realized I had to learn how to learn. My teacher would come in sometimes, he would show you something, literally just walk through it, go through it 2 or 3 times, and then you walk away. And as far as he was concerned, at that moment, you were taught. It was your responsibility to consider what he just showed you, dig into it, give yourself some ideas. What we think of in scholastics as a discovery instructionary model was the primary model that I had to learn from. Then when he saw you sweating and working over it, he would walk over and show you it's not quite like that, it's quite like this. But you had to put in all the sweat equity to begin with to get those detailed instructions. Well, for that to happen, I started developing a notebook. And I still have it. It's sitting here. Some of my students have seen it, where it's got a old-timey 3-ring binder, thick notebook. And in it, on these pages, I had illustrations with arrows pointing this way and that way, keywords, and most people could not follow it. I wasn't trying to hide it. I was just trying to put it in my language. But if someone was to see it who didn't know me, they could learn things in chunks. But my students could look at it and have an excellent idea of what I was reminding myself of. I did not realize that I had created my own T.W. Smith Bubishi that covered 6 styles of Chinese martial arts, a couple of weapon sections, 4 styles of meditation, and 7 systems Qigong in my own library. But I must also say this, the guys who illustrated the things and discussed things in their way inside the Bubishi were much, much better artists than I am. I was unfortunately what you might call a stickman artist, and it was not very pretty. Oh. But the authors go on and they say that in this section, it was all about the images, not the words. Besides, they would have said all they had wished to say in the written section of the text anyway. Then, according to the scholars, if the Bubishi's authors added text to their illustrated section, it was because they found that it was necessary. However, they probably did not want a text so long that it would eclipse the illustration itself. The lines that they created had to complement that image, not overshadow it. Mr. Nissan states that adding these short sentences were like adding a soundtrack to a film. The purpose was to make the images come to life, to transform a cartoon into live action. If these characters, whatever their individual meaning is, were intended to transform the images into live action, then they were not merely names of techniques. They had to form an expressive phrase which was designed to evoke scenes of various actions and movements, not just a static image. For many Chinese martial arts practitioners, you probably already know that. where the names depict more than a technique. It is supposed to give you a visualization of an expression or a focus. For example, dragon whips his tail. Or one of my principal techniques that I use in my martial arts almost all the time when I'm sparring is tiger leaping from the mountain. Mr. Nissan says, imagine an image of two gunslingers facing one another. And there's this little additional text that says on the right, cross draw, and then fast draw on the left. These names evoke certain dynamic scenes and get us out of a static image. But what is key is the deeper level of embodied knowledge that you will have if you see the illustrations with the lines. For anyone who is trained with pistols, they know they must familiarize themselves with many details. How to wear the guns, how to transfer the gun from one hand to the other, how to catch the hammer with one's thumb, how to move one's hip, all of those details before he has a real idea of how this cross-draw technique should look like. In other words, phrases such as cross-draw and fast-draw on their own are not enough to transform an image into a vivid, dynamic scene. You have to have an embodied knowledge of what that would transpire into. In Chinese language aspects, the character shao or hand, which appears numerous times in the text, these accompany the illustrations, and they also provide another clue that we are dealing here with something much greater than just the mere names of techniques, because the character shao is used as a short for shao fa, which means hand methods. Something else in the Chinese martial arts that is a little bit confusing at times for students, particularly if they're coming from another style or system, is that very seldom, whenever I use the word hand, do I literally mean from your wrist down. And to understand what hand methods means is actually relative to the practitioner. So when I say hand, if they're a beginning person, they're usually going to think literally of the wrist down, their hand. If they're a little bit better practitioner and got more experiences and understanding, they may think from their shoulder down to their fingertips. So basically everything that's involved. So when I say hand, they're going to think from their shoulder all the way down. And that's what we would think of as a higher level practitioner. However, when it gets good, when I say the word hand, it means all the way from one fingertip all the way to the other fingertip. So it includes the spine, and when I say hand, they're all moving together. There's only one hand, and that is both physical arms all the way through the spine to the fingertips. Now, I may have to make one adjustment on one side or the other, but again, it's one of those relative things that in the Chinese martial arts that the practitioner usually learns as they've been in the training for a while. As I say that, I'm also thinking of my friend Paul Cody, who you'll be able to meet at the Martial Arts Science and Application Symposium with me next week, just outside of Charlotte, North Carolina, in Dallas. Paul Cody is very good at helping folks understand Shao Fa and the hand methods. So even though Shao Fa is usually translated as technique, they are much more than that. Just like the gunslinger metaphor, in Chinese Kung Fu, hand methods stand for the physical movements of the hands which reflect the theoretical principles or the laws that are associated with that specific art. And this is very important. And I was literally just having that conversation with Paul Cody just a couple of months ago. That each art, as I was taught, had a very specific focus. It had laws associated with it in itself. And they were not taught as one style has it all. Rather, that each art has specific strengths and weaknesses. The old-timers from the 18th century, the 19th century, and up into the very early 20th century learned various styles to round out their training. The styles were the stone that they would sharpen themselves against. The style was not the instrument. You, the practitioner, you are the instrument of the martial arts. The styles are what help you sharpen yourself in various areas. This concept is the same thing as just like every weapon has its greatest potential threat as well as having its limitations. Understanding those are essential, and they make you better as far as the practice of using them goes. When it comes to understanding the applications in the Bubishi, a hand method is a yin and yang pair, with hand being the yang, the physical, invisible aspects of the art, and the laws that are generating your movement, those are the yin. They're the abstract, the hidden aspects of the movement. Now, this is something, if you ever get the opportunity to go to one of Ian Abernathy's seminars where he's sharing with you the Bubishi applications, he's going to use terms like this. He describes them as husband and wife hands, where the hand methods are working complementary to one another to achieve a specific objective. And this is a very good concept in describing a higher level of understanding of Xiaofa. I have an excellent Kempo student that often refers to it when I mention it to him as push and pull. And at a fundamental state, that is correct. But this type of push-pull reference is too mechanical, is too linear, because the methods do not always mean push and pull mechanically. In some instances they do, but in every application they're supposed to work like a good husband and wife do, both trying to meet one single objective. And if that includes push-pull, fine, but it may not. So besides the Xiaofa, the hand methods, and the laws associated with it, we want to understand the lines, the mnemonic that goes with it. By definition, a mnemonic is a pattern of letters, ideas, or associations that help us remember something. In traditional Chinese martial arts terms, this is called koju. It's also important, and I know this probably goes without saying, in order to understand the koju, the mnemonic, you must have an idea of what they are discussing, or it renders the mnemonic useless. And I want to give you an example. Here is a U.S. Marine Corps mnemonic. JJ did tie buckle. Now what does that mean? What image does that put in your mind? A young man named JJ tying his buckle? Well, the mnemonic actually is for leadership traits. JJ did tie buckle stands for justice, judgment, dependability, initiative, decisiveness, tact, integrity, enthusiasm, bearing, unselfishness, courage, knowledge, loyalty, endurance. JJ did tie buckle. It is a mnemonic for leadership, and unless you know what they're talking about, the mnemonic means nothing. So, that brings us to understanding a little bit more Xiaofa and Koju. Xiaofa has both oral and written instructions, and are simply a specific kind of Koju. The hand methods are like formulas, and what that means is that Koju may address a wide variety of instructions associated with your overall technique and your overall expression. So, for example, it may touch on posture, your attitude, your objective, mental state, acupoints or target zones, tactics, while Xiaofa Koju is focused on the subject of movement and techniques. But all of the Koju, the mnemonics, just like the Marine Corps JJ did tie buckle, convey vital information. And all of the Koju were at some level encrypted and were short. I hope you found that episode informative, as we covered Chapters 2, the contents and structure of the Bubishi, Chapter 3, Revere Heaven and Emulate the Ancestors. Then we looked into the Ryuku House at Chapter 4, and then Crane Formation, and closed it up with an introduction of Xiaofa and Koju as related to Chinese text and martial arts. In the upcoming episode, we're going to be picking up some more on the Xiaofa, and we're going to take one of the illustrations and break it down with an understanding of the Xiaofa and Koju. Then I'm going to provide a perspective that you may want to consider anytime you're reading some of the Chinese texts, particularly ones that were authored by folks who have a Confucian background, which many of them were. Then we'll close it out with a summarization of all 5 episodes, and it's going to be about another 25 to 30 minutes long. Exploring the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts. Thank you so much for joining me today. Have a fantastic practice. Get out there, do your best. Remember, sweat equity is by far the greatest measure of a good practice. Take care, and I'll be talking with you soon.